products and services, while less advanced countries compete with cost and price. So using the framework of generic competitiveness that has two strategic directions. One is cost strategy and the other is differentiated strategy. We have tried a different ranking for each of these. In other words, if 67 countries compete with low cost and therefore price, and the ranking will be somewhat different from what we have seen previously. So with this cost strategy-based model, we see that Korea is down from number 21 to 33. In other words, if Korean economy and companies in Korea try to compete and beat the products from less developed countries with low price only, then Korea will lose its competitiveness by 12 level. On the other hand, China will move up from 15th position to number 3. Obviously, China is very strong with low cost and therefore low price. Japan is further down from 22 to 27. So Japan is also losing its ground if Japan competes with low cost. Now let's have another ranking, this time using the differentiation strategy. If all of these 67 countries compete with high quality, high price, highly differentiated way of producing and providing services, then Korea will move up from 21 to 17. China will be down from 15th to 23rd. Japan will move up from 22nd to 20th. So this shows that what countries, each country should use a certain appropriate strategy to make sure that the economy has better standing in competitiveness. Well, this table shows, in the case of Korea, first of all, which countries stand highest in each of these 8 factors. For example, in the factor conditions, United States number 1, Russia number 2, Canada number 3, and so on. In business context, Singapore tops other countries. Related industries, US. Demand conditions, US, as Mr. Bates has presented previously. Workers, India, China. Politicians and bureaucrats, Singapore and Denmark. And entrepreneurs, Singapore and Israel and Netherlands. Professionals, Singapore and Netherlands. So from this table already, you see why Singapore is number 1 and United States number 2. Korea is down below in factor conditions at 55th. Business context, number 19. Related industries, 23rd. Demand conditions, quite high at number 6. Workers, quite low at 44th. Politicians and bureaucrats, quite low at 43rd. Entrepreneurs, relatively high at 15th. And professionals, quite all right at 16th. So if we look at, if we graphically show these conditions for each of these 8 factors, you can see that Korea's physical factors are from 55th at factor conditions to very high level at demand conditions at 6. In people, Korean economy is quite weak at workers and politicians and bureaucrats, but quite strong at entrepreneurs and professionals. Now, there is another feature that marks IPS model different from either IMD or WF. That is, these 67 countries do not compete against one another. Well, small-sized countries compete themselves, and large-sized countries compete. And also, strong countries compete themselves, weak countries compete themselves. So we have categorized 67 countries into countries of 9 groups. So this picture shows along the y-axis, first along the x-axis, whether the countries are small or big. And the criteria are the size of land and the population. And then along the y-axis, whether the economies are strong or weak. Then we have 9 categories, from strong small countries to weak and large countries. Now there are about 21 countries that belong to small-sized countries, and 20 countries that belong to medium-sized countries, and 26 countries that belong to large-sized countries. And Korea belongs to medium-sized group, and in terms of economic level, Korea is the weakest among the 7 more or less strong economies. The countries that are stronger in this medium-sized group are Sweden, Finland, United Kingdom, Taiwan, New Zealand, and France. So it is quite obvious that Korea should emulate or should have these 6 countries as a benchmark in its development of strategy to make Korea move up along the rank. Perhaps it is not advisable for Korea to follow the strategies of strong countries in the small-sized group or large-sized countries of group of countries. In the case of China, it is one of stronger economies in large-sized group of countries. Among 6 strong countries in this group, China stands number 4, and Japan stands number 6. Now, what kind of strategies can we develop for the nations? Well, this is the picture that I had already showed. A country can choose either cost strategy or differentiation strategy. What that means is, in order to compete with cost, the country should emphasize factor conditions and workers. On the other hand, if an economy wants to compete with differentiation strategy, then it should emphasize demand conditions of professionals and possibly related industries and entrepreneurs. So relative importance should vary depending on which strategy you choose. This is already shown, so let me skip this. Now, this picture already again shows how the relative standing of Korea, China, and Japan had changed over the years. I will start from the year 2005. In 2005, Japan was the highest among these 3 countries at rank number 19. And Japan could become number 1 if it had chosen differentiation strategy. On the other hand, it would have moved down to 37 if Japan had chosen cost-based strategy. Korea was number 22 at the time, and Korea could become number 5 if it had chosen differentiation, and alternatively 49th if Korea had chosen cost strategy. China was number 24 in 2005, and it would have moved a little bit to 21st if it had chosen cost-based strategy, but differentiation 26th if it had chosen differentiation. Now, 2006 picture is similar, but now a little bit higher among these countries. And then 2007 2008, 2009, and this year. So along these 6 years, there have been some changes, relative changes among these three countries. This picture, this table shows more graphically how relative standing of these three countries had changed. Now, from 2001, this table shows the 10-year history of the changes in competitiveness of these three countries. Let me start with Japan. Japan was number 7 10 years ago. Now it is 22nd. So among the three countries, Japan was the highest 10 years ago. Now it is the lowest. China, on the other hand, was 45th only 10 years ago. Now it is 15th. So among the three countries, China was the lowest, but now it is the highest. Korea, on the other hand, was relatively stable, around 21, 22, 24, and so on. So Korea was number 22 10 years ago. It is 21 now. But you can see that as of 2007, China surpassed Korea. 2009, last year, China surpassed Japan. This year, Korea surpassed Japan. So there was a drastic change, inverse ranking now among these three countries. China is now number 1. Then, what kind of competition or cooperation these three countries can have vis-a-vis the other? Now, let me compare Korea and Japan. Well, Korean data is shown on the left, Japanese data is shown on the right. And if we see the difference, net difference between these two countries, then we see the result on the bottom side of the left part. That is, well, the sheer difference in each of these 8 factors between the two countries suggests that there is a possibility, there is a potential for cooperation between the two countries if these two countries can establish some strategic alliance or collaboration. Here we see that there is probably the biggest gap in entrepreneurs and professionals, and also in related and supporting industries and politicians and bureaucrats. And the sum of the absolute values of these 8 factors was 67. And that perhaps represents the possibility of cooperation between Korea and Japan, and also the areas where these countries can cooperate. Now let me compare Korea and China. Again, Korea is quite good at demand conditions and professionals, entrepreneurs, low at factor conditions and workers. On the other hand, China is better at factor conditions and workers, while business context and professionals, China is lower than Korea. So this table shows the net difference between Korea and China. The biggest gap difference rests at factor conditions and politicians and bureaucrats and workers. And the sum of the absolute values of these 8 factors is about 100. So that means that the gap between Korea and China is bigger than the gap between Korea and Japan. Now, this shows the gap between Japan and China. Again, each respective country has strengths and weaknesses vis-a-vis the other. And the main difference would be at the factor conditions, demand conditions, workers, and so on. And the net, the sum of the absolute values of these 8 factors is 85. So the possibility of areas between these two countries would be in between Korea, Japan, and Korea, China. So let me summarize. Well, let me start with China. Over the past 10 years, China has enhanced its national competitiveness from 45th to 15th. Quite a dramatic surge. China surpassed, as a result of this, Korea in 2007 and Japan in 2009, becoming the most competitive in East Asian economic bloc. Now, China shows a greater potential with a differentiation strategy. So the time has come for China to also shift its strategic focus from cost to differentiation. So within years, China will show a portfolio of strategies which would be very similar to that of Japan and Korea. So that means China will have better performance with differentiation strategy than with low-cost strategy in the future. In the case of Japan, Japan's competitiveness, unfortunately, has plummeted from number 7 to number 22 in the last 10 years. As a result, Japan was surpassed by China last year and by Korea this year, becoming the least competitive. Japan could, however, have been number 1 with differentiation strategy 10 years ago. And Japan's low-cost strategy, if it chooses, will make Japan 54. So choosing the right strategy is imperative for Japanese economy. Now Korea. Korea has been relatively stable over the past 10 years, oscillating in between 21 and 25. Its rank of 21st this year, is the highest in the last 10 years. Korea was surpassed by China 3 years ago, but it surpasses Japan this year, staying in the second most competitive position, or middle position, in this East Asian economic bloc. Korea clearly shows that a differentiation strategy is much better than a low-cost strategy. Without changing anything, Korea's competitiveness can move up from 17th to 10th simply by adopting differentiation strategy. Altogether, Korea, China, and Japan compete with one another, but there is a great potential for cooperation because many of their competitiveness variables are complementary. But among the three pairs, Korea-China pair will generate higher complementary effect than Korea-Japan or Japan-China combination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cho. Next speaker is Dr. Hwy-Chang Moon. He's going to talk about Industry Competitiveness 2010. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Moon to you. Hwy-Chang Moon received his PhD degree from the University of Washington and is currently a professor of international business and strategy in the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. In parallel with his Seoul National University professorship, Dr. Moon is director of Institute for Policy and Strategy on National Competitiveness. To the field of international business, he has contributed particularly by developing several new analytical tools, including the generalized double diamond approach to international competitiveness and the imbalance theory of foreign direct investment. Professor Moon is currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of International Business and Economy. He has consulted many international companies, international organizations such as APEC, World Bank, and UNCTAD, and governments, Malaysia, Dubai, and so on. Okay, please welcome him with a big applause, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think everybody knows that the competitiveness is a very important concept, and the national level competitiveness is very important. But the problem is there's no good model for measure and then evaluating the national level competitiveness. So actually, we got together last January, and some National Competitiveness Council members, as Mr. Bill Bates said, we met together in Saudi Arabia and talked about some issues that we need to do in the future. And then we have concluded a couple of points. Number one is the existing models for measuring national competitiveness are not that much satisfactory, including the IMD model and WF model. And number two is, so we need to collaborate to develop a new model to correctly measure the national competitiveness. So we have done a lot of work, as Professor Cho mentioned, at IPS, but still no work is complete. So we'd like to continue to collaborate with National Competitiveness Council of USA and also Global Forum of Competitiveness. So we'd like to continue to work with Mr. Bill Bates to improve the analytical model to measure the national level competitiveness. And one more point that we talked at the last meeting is, actually the nations compete not directly. This is not a war. This is a business game. So nations compete through industries. So we may have to choose some, probably not all, but very important industries. So Mr. Bill Bates also mentioned the importance of new uprising industries such as green technology or green industry. So this is very important to choose some industries and then compare the competitiveness and identify some of the weaknesses for improvement. And this is kind of next level of our research. So we started with national level competitiveness, but we have to continue to narrow down the level of analysis from national level to more micro level, and that is industry level competitiveness, and that is the topic that I'm going to do today. And actually, we have done a lot of work on national level competitiveness for the last several years, but this is the first time for us to introduce industry level competitiveness. However, we have found a very interesting conclusion. Number one is the models that we are using for national level and industry level are pretty much consistent. So I'm going to show like a theoretical part of the consistency in model, and also the implications are pretty informative and useful, and I'm going to show that. So the content is introduction and conceptual framework and results and analysis. And number one is, I'd like to highlight the experience of Korea. Not because I'm Korean, and not because this is Korea, but Korea has experienced a very interesting kind of economic achievement for a relatively short period of time for the last 50 years. And the industries that Korea is very competitive are very interesting industries, so that can be studied by other countries. But anyway, to the case of Korea. So let me briefly introduce the economic success of Korea for the last several decades. And as many people already know, the Korea GDP was about $100, 1962, about 50 years ago, and then 10 times in 15 years, $1,000, and then exceeding $10,000 in 1995, and then eventually $20,000. For the last 50 years, Korean GDP per capita has 200 times increased, and this is amazing, and this is actually the miracle. And there's a good internationalization. We did the import and substitution export promotion. We established KOTRA at this time, from trade to investment, inbound investment, outbound investment, and openness of the capital market, membership into the WTO and OECD through globalization. So Korea has successfully integrated its economy into the global economy. But anyway, the main point of my presentation is how Korea has achieved kind of competitive industries. In 1960, 50 years ago, Korea was this much poor. The car was a major transportation vehicle. 1970s, we tried to produce black and white TV sets. And then 80s, hardworking. 1990s, a little high tech. But final year 2000, Korea is number one in shipbuilding industry. It's definitely number one. But the problem is, according to classical theories of competitive advantage, for example, you have to have some natural resources and then labor and money and technology. But at the time, Korea did not have anything. And how could Korea achieve this kind of amazing economic achievement? So this is a very interesting case, and existing theories of models of competitive advantage theory type of things may not be satisfactory to explain this kind of successful case. So we need like a new model, and we can apply the model for national level to the industrial level, and it works. So Korean case is very interesting, and we have chosen the 5 interesting Korean cases: shipbuilding, automobile, iron and steel, and petrochemicals and semiconductor. But semiconductor has not enough data, so in the final moment we will delete it because we are using the OECD statistics, but their classification is a little out of date, and they don't actually classify the semiconductors as independent SIC code. So we're going to go over only 4 key industries: shipbuilding, automobile, iron and steel, and petrochemicals. And then model, analytical framework. Again, our target is to understand the real-world practice. But if you would like to just understand the real-world practice, it's too complicated to be understood. So you need a kind of conceptual framework as a window or as a shortcut to the understanding of the real-world complexity. The model is the IPS model, but it's going to be revised because we are going to continue to collaborate with GCC. But anyway, so far, as Professor Cho said, the base model is Michael Porter, and most of his work is based on his 1990 diamond model and extended in 1998 and the year 2000. And Professor Cho extended it to the 9-factor model by incorporating human factors. But there's another dimension for extension led by Professor Rugman and also some other scholars, including myself. And actually, our model is incorporating both of these revisions or extensions. So we incorporate like a 9-factor model and double the 9-fact, and this is the IPS model, but it's going to be changed again. So probably the collaboration of IPS and GCC or whatever. So we'll work on this. IPS model, Professor Cho explained. But now, Professor Cho explained the national level competitiveness, but my theme is industry level competitiveness, and we have a little problem with the data collection. Because the human factors, politicians and bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, they don't have industry-specific variables for these determinants. So we had to give up. But still some data for workers and professionals. So we incorporate some of the workers and professionals data into the original, the diamond model. So we are a little bit mixed up, these two framework, but as years go by, and we're going to incorporate some other specific data, and we're gonna make it better. But this year, this is the first year, but still, again, it's not perfect, but the implications and results are very meaningful, and we can draw a lot of important implications from this research. This is the kind of the design of the computational index. The final, we need like a composite overall index. This is composed of 4 main factors, like the factor condition of the 4 determinants of diamond. And we're going to look at 2 different perspectives: domestic perspective and international perspective. And there are sub-factors, and again, there are some specific criteria. So the total number of criteria is 32. And let me briefly go over some of the characteristics or the concepts, definitions of variables. So the broadest category is 4: factor conditions, demand conditions, release support, and SSR. And factor conditions, first, we categorize them into 2. One is basic factor conditions, the other is advanced factor conditions. And actually, at this time, we did not give any weight to these variables. However, economically speaking, basic factors such as labor cost might be more important for more developing side, and the advanced are more developed. But anyway, those are too complicated. But anyway, we classify 2 different types of basic factor conditions. One is basic, the other is advanced, and then again, domestic and international. And then specifically, labor cost and labor productivity and outward FDI. The reason why we put outward FDI is if a country's labor cost is low, that is fine. But if the country's labor cost is not low, then the country or the industry of the country would like to solve this problem through investing in cheaper location countries, like China or India. So that the higher the level outward FDI may solve some of the labor cost problems in home countries. So a combination of these variables may explain the competitiveness of those industries for the factor conditions. Likewise, technology and inward FDI. We also included the growth index. So these are the factor conditions. And now the data, we are trying to collect the data from industry perspective, but some data are not available, so we kind of utilize the country data. The data source should be consistent, so we collect most of the data from OECD statistical data set, database, but sometimes the data are not available, so we utilize some other information sources. And one interesting point is China is not a member of OECD, but China is very important in these 4 industries, like number 1 in car production and on top ranking countries. So we had to include China, whether you like it or not. But data is not available in the OECD database, so we collected the data for China from various data sources. So here, for example, like the labor cost of China is drawn from the China statistics. So there are some problems in the consistency of the sources of data, but this is the typical problem with all the social science research. The demand conditions, we also categorize size and quality of demand. Even if the country is very big, but the quality is low, we don't give that much credit. So size and quality, domestic and international, domestic consumption size, growth rate, and then export size and growth rate of export. And also market sophistication, whether the consumers in these countries are very much sensitive to the sophistication of the quality, brand, or health and environment, or new products, and these are more sophisticated market conditions. And then GDP per capita, a number of countries, and some diversification of their export market. If the country depends on just one country like USA, the exchange rate fluctuations may significantly affect their competitiveness, so we need to be diversified, so diversification ratio is included as the quality of the international market demand. Related industries, basic and advanced, domestic and international, and transportation and communication. Some kind of container transportation, communication, and general backgrounds, general infrastructures in terms of like R&D expenditures, student graduate, this is the level of education quality of the country, and international cooperation in patents, and then some foreign students. If the infrastructure is good, we hypothesize that foreign students come to that country to study more, right? So like, as Mr. Bill Bates said, the America is like, the American kids are not good at math score and science scores. It's below the average of OECD. But the reason why the American technological base is so high is because they are attracting foreign students. Then they're actually helping the competitiveness of US education or technological base. So we need to incorporate some of the international dimensions into the competitiveness of national level and also industry level competitiveness. And now business context. What about the structure of rivalry? Or what about the general strategy of the countries in the industry? And also governance structure of the industries. The competition, domestic and international, number of enterprises, and rivalry situation. This is actually the soft data, not hard data. So we have 67 something countries, like a 200 data set information, and this is from the IPS and our data base. International, and how many multinational corporations are operating and competing with other local firms in the industry in that country. And what about international competition? Is firm's decision, is it high or low? Again, IPS data. Domestic firm strategy, whether the firm strategy is rational or efficient and very effective, or corruption index, and this is abstract from Transparency International, tariff barriers and equal treatment, whether they are equally treated or not to foreign enterprises. So again, we are trying to cooperate all the data sets from OECD, but some data are complemented with other data sets from other information sources. This is the sample countries. So we included OECD countries and China, because China is a big guy. But some of the OECD countries, they do not have enough data, like Brazil and India and Thailand and Iran and Russia, they do not have enough data sets. So we have to exclude these countries and then added China. So the total number of samples for each country is 15, 16, and around 15 or so. So these are our samples for each industry. And now the results. So the result, I'm going to show you the overall rankings and also some subcategories, the factor rankings. The overall rankings, auto, shipbuilding, iron and steel, and chemicals. In automobile, number 1 is Germany, followed by Japan. UK is here, right? US and Korea. Korea is number 5. Shipbuilding, definitely Korea. So the major players in the shipbuilding industry are all Korean firms. Korea is number one, followed by US, Norway, and the Netherlands, and Australia and Japan. And iron and steel, US, Korea, and Germany, Japan, UK, and China. And chemicals, US, UK, Germany, Netherlands, Japan, and Korea. So Korea is actually pretty good, like a 5, 1, 2, and a 6. And it's actually amazing and it's very interesting. So these are the overall rankings, and I'm going to show you the sub-factor, like a factor rankings. So in automobile, the total is 5, but the factors, we have 4 major categories. The production side, the input factor, the factor conditions, and output is the demand conditions, related industries and business context. And these are the rankings, and 7, 5, and 10, and 1. And we also categorize their D represent domestic ranking, and I means purely international ranking. So domestic ranking, international ranking, overall domestic and international ranking. But anyways, it's pretty good. And shipbuilding is no comparison actually. It's number 1, even if it's 8-1 and 8-8-1. And shipbuilding is number 1, and this domestic is 4, international is 1. This is to say, internationalization of shipbuilding in Korea actually contributed to the competitiveness of overall competitiveness of Korean shipbuilding. So internationalization is very much important because Korea is not that gigantic economy. You have to incorporate international dimensions into the competitiveness of your industry. The next one is iron and steel and chemicals. And iron and steel, Korea's ranking is number 2, and their actual the factor rankings are this, and chemicals and like this. So not bad. This is to say there's no significantly deficient factor. There's some lows, but the combination is not that bad. If there's any serious weakness in one of these factors, then that's a problem. But it's overall, it's not that bad. And now, these are the results. But our main goal is not just to show the rankings. Those are the numbers. But as a scholar, we have to derive some of the important implications for using in the real world. So analytical part, and some portion of the analysis is a little academic, but I'd like to minimize the academic content of the analysis. And then I'm going to give some very important or interesting implications to the practitioners as well as scholars. And those implications are a little bit different from our common sense, or they can explain better. So I have done 2 levels of analysis. Number 1 is group analysis, and the other one is policy-related analysis. This is automobile, and we draw this kind of a diagram. And the horizontal, the x-axis represent RCA, and RCA means down there's a note. RCA is revealed competitive advantage. This is a typical index that the international economists are using. So this is a revealed competitive advantage. It's measured by like export minus import. This is actually trade surplus divided by the amount of trade, export plus import. This is the relative importance of trade. So the higher the level of this index means the country or the industry is doing good, more export, more trade surplus, more export than import. This is RCA. On the vertical axis, we have PCA. This is potential competitiveness. And this is the index that we have calculated. This is the calculation of the 4 determinants of diamond and subfactors and elements of 32. This is the result of this. This is actually the overall and real or fundamental capabilities of the industry. So this is potential, this is real core competence. And this is revealed competence in the real marketplace. So if the market is really efficient, if the market is really fair, if the market is perfect, and they should go together. They should be perfect. Your revealed competitiveness and your potential competitiveness. So it's very interesting to show the diagram comparing the PCA, the potential competitiveness, versus trade performance. And we have identified 3 distinct groups, Group A and B and C. In automobile, and Group A is high trade performance RCA and high PCA, and Group B is medium RCA and low PCA, and Group C is low RCA but high PCA. But anyway, Group 1 includes 3 countries, Germany, Japan, and Korea. 2 very interesting conclusions or implications can be found. And Germany trade performance is lower than Japan and Korea. They don't export that much. Well, Japan and Korea are doing better in this auto industry. However, their potential competitiveness, the vertical axis, is very high. This is number one. So the German has really still greatest potential, but in the marketplace, and Korea and Japan are doing better. And number two is Korea is really catching up with Japan. They haven't done a pretty good job. So two interesting kind of things. And number two, in the medium group, the lower part, Mexico and Turkey, are not that competitive. Even if they are doing good in their export, but they are not doing good in actually their potential competitiveness. And China is number one. This is the highest PCA and also the largest production. And I think, even if we need to do more rigorous work, but I think in the medium group, and most of the countries are like developing countries, and I think they are doing pretty good in the international marketplace through foreign direct investment from multinational firms. So they started their business through multinational firms, but now they are developing their own industries. So anyway, interesting comparison between the group 2 and the other two groups. The group 3 is export performance is not good, it's pretty low, but their actual competitiveness is pretty high, like UK and then US. So this is kind of interesting, so that's why their export performance is not good. Export not that good, import a lot, because this is minus sign, but their potential is good. So that's probably why these guys are complaining about the trade policies of Korea and Japan and some other Asian countries. You guys are doing like a protectionism like that. So we can show some of the evidences of this kind of strategic trade policy. This is automobile. I can talk more about that one, but just let me skip it to the next industry. The next one is shipbuilding. And Group A, Group B, and Group C. Group A is upper right-hand corner, and there's a good trade performance and also high level of potential. And then Korea is number one among the 3 or 4 countries. And number one is Korea and Japan and China. And there's a little